So you can't have one without the other. You can't say we want more jobs, more businesses, more opportunity for our kids, but otherwise we want everything to stay exactly the same. It just doesn't work that way. But what we can do is make sure that we're working with organizations and institutions in the community to preserve affordable housing, to make sure that it is residents that are benefiting. Those are the kinds of plans, activities, foresight that we have to have in order to get that perfect balance, revitalizing and renewing the community, but also making sure that people who are already living there are benefiting from it.
This is Jacqueline Luqman with the Real News Network. So you just saw President or former President Barack Obama talking about trying to achieve a perfect balance in revitalizing a neighborhood and making sure existing residents have affordable housing and the things that they need. He's specifically talking about the plans to build his Obama Center in the South Side neighborhood of Jackson Heights in Chicago, Illinois. A few days before the Super Bowl, Nike announced that they were contributing $5 million to the Obama Center project in the South Side Chicago neighborhood. Now, this was announced through Nike's Office of Social and Community Impact, and Nike and Obama seem to be ignoring the Chicago community's voice on the impact that the project has on them. Why do I say that, you wonder? Well, listen to some of the concerns from a community activist from that neighborhood in Chicago.
The concerns that have been raised and will continue to be raised in relationship to this presidential center is not opposition to the presidential center, is not opposition to the former president, is not opposition to development, right? What we have is a situation where the Obama Presidential Center can very well be a Trojan horse that's going to drive displacement and gentrification in this part of town.
So I wonder, is President Obama really trying to achieve this perfect balance between meeting the needs of existing community members and providing, what did he call it? He didn't call it gentrification, progress? I'm talking with Bill Fletcher Jr., who is a racial justice and labor and international activist and the author of They're Bankrupting Us and Other Myths About Unions and Solidarity Divided, to parse out what to make of this announcement from Nike and to examine Nike's real motives and efforts in relation to actual social and racial justice and their juxtaposition to the politics of the Obama era and Black Americans. Bill Fletcher, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
So I know that outside of Chicago, this issue of the tension between the community members and the Chicago neighborhood on the South Side, which is the poorest and the Blackest neighborhood in Chicago, and the plans for Obama Center might not be well known. But there is an existing tension between the Black community and Obama's policies, and this tension between these community activists and some members of the community do seem to kind of reflect that, with the community members saying that they're not happy with the plans to privatize some of the public park, to turn some of the public land into a parking lot that would be for profit for a private industry. And it seems like Obama's not listening to the community, kind of like he didn't during his presidency. What are your feelings on that, if that's true?
This is way beyond Obama. This is a pattern that we've seen in city after city with what are called redevelopment efforts. And what frequently happens is that there is a major construction or development piece in a rundown area. And that becomes the anchor for the transformation of that area. Now, people can say, well, the area needs to transform and we need to get rid of urban blight or whatever. The problem that happens, though, is that frequently when this goes down, there's essentially a racial and class cleansing of the area and the introduction of new populations. It's what we know as gentrification. And so when I say this is beyond Obama, this is not, and I don't think we should look at this as a problem specific to the former president. I think we have to understand that what he is doing is consistent with the way that many of our cities have been transformed to the detriment of working class people, such that increasing numbers of our cities are inhospitable to working class people. They're unaffordable. People are pushed further and further out. But it sometimes starts with this kind of project. And one of the difficulties is that we're so in need of raising our tax base. We're so in need of jobs. We're so in need of overall development that sometimes people don't ask the tough questions and don't approach this as a negotiation that needs to happen.
So this is what we're really talking about, Bill, is not an issue of the community versus Obama, which is actually what the activists from the community said, that this was not resistance to Obama. It's not resistance to the former president. It's not even resistance to the Obama Center. But maybe it's the word that maybe a lot of people don't know, but we are familiar with. It's resistance to neoliberalism. It's resistance to gentrification. Right. It's resistance to the privatization of public access, public spaces, reducing affordable housing, policies that benefit private developers and limit access to communities that working and poor people have lived in for decades, for generations, with their families. All of a sudden, they can't afford to live in those neighborhoods anymore because someone had the great idea that the neighborhood needed to be transformed and ostensibly improved, but the people who lived there were priced out of the improved neighborhood through privatization schemes that working and poor people can't afford. So they're asking for So they're challenging neoliberalism, not necessarily Obama, right?
I in the U.S. context, I talk about capitalist fundamentalism because sometimes people get confused with this term neoliberalism, even though I agree with you. Most of the world understands what that means. In the United States, we get confused. But yes. You see, in a lot of cities, think about it like this. Stadiums have been created in rundown areas. The areas are often run down. The areas need to be redeveloped. People don't like living in poverty. They don't like living in a situation where they're in rat traps. They don't like living in places where there's not public transportation. People don't want that. And so a developer comes in and says, we're going to introduce a stadium. And when we introduce a stadium, there'll be jobs, there'll be greater public transportation, et cetera, et cetera. People say, okay. And then the stadium is built, and part of the result of that is that other developers come in and they start buying up the land around the stadium. And they start introducing restaurants and they start introducing new apartments, et cetera. And the people that had been living there can no longer afford to live there, or they may literally be just simply removed if where they were living ends up being bought by someone and then taken down. So a lot of this revolves around what happened in the late 60s and early 70s when a segment of the capitalist class that goes by the acronym FIRE, finance, insurance, and real estate, became the dominant segment within the major metropolitan areas. And they began a process of transforming the cities. And many of us identified that as gentrification, but it was more than gentrification. It really was a transformation of the cities, the ousting of many of the traditional industries that had been there, the transformation of the cities from the standpoint of immigrant populations, the way that the cities had operated for European immigrants versus what happened when you had immigrants from the global south. All of these things are happening. So this then ends up being this problem in Chicago. And the focal point is around the Obama Library. But we shouldn't understand it to be caused by the Obama Library. It's caused by a certain vision of what the cities should actually look like.
Wow. And this is definitely something I can attest to living in Washington, D.C., in Southeast Washington, D.C., the poorest and the blackest area of the city, where developers are finally making their way into revitalizing exactly what you said,
Yes.
Bill, a poor neighborhood that doesn't have a lot of attractive, glistening infrastructure. But now that's kind of, well, it's not kind of, now it's actually spreading in areas that had been pretty much the epicenter of why Washington, D.C. and cities like it were predominantly Black chocolate city and full of working class and poor people. All right, so now I want to pivot a little bit to Nike, because here's the other part of this issue in Chicago in particular. And Nike got some publicity and some public respect last year for sticking by Colin Kaepernick through him being blackballed by the NFL. They made him the face of their ad campaign for 2019. They even put his image on a shoe late last year, which sold out quickly, the shoe did. Now they announce a few days before the Super Bowl that they plan to donate $5 million to the building of the Obama Center project, specifically to the basketball court. And a very public announcement through their Office of, I think it's called Social and Community Impact. Here's my question, Bill. Is Nike continuing a streak of altruism? Or should we be skeptical of their motives, considering the motives of capitalism in this kind of development in neighborhoods like the South Side of Chicago across the country, and considering that Nike is a multi-billion-dollar global conglomerate? And should we really be looking at them as like the financial backers of the movement?
Well, there's a lot there to unpack. I would start with this, that what Nike has been very successful in doing is disconnecting race from class. And this has become a banner for some of the movement. And it's actually very unsettling when I've seen elements within the Black freedom movement who don't get class and are quick to embrace the corporate racial message. So what happens with a company like Nike is that they don't have production facilities in the United States. They have production facilities in the global South. They have been repeatedly cited around sweatshop labor issues, anti-union activity, et cetera. And there's been many criticisms of the company. What the company does, and I think that they've been really quite successful at this, is that they situate themselves as a visionary company on issues of diversity. and particularly race and gender. And so you'll take a situation like the Colin Kaepernick crisis, or not crisis, controversy. And so Nike situates itself. It understands the market. It understood that it would lose customers, the racists, but that it would be viewed by many in Black America and among other people of color as a real champion of racial justice for standing by Colin. This is one of the problems with the way that neoliberal or capitalist fundamentalists approach this matter of race. The issue of class, the issue of labor, foreign labor, is brushed out of the picture. So that what we are supposed to do is look at the Black, in our case, the Black athletes that are promoted by Nike, that get good contracts by Nike, therefore endorse Nike. And we're supposed to look at them as being really a champion of our issues and our interests. And this is a mistake. And this is not to say that people shouldn't take the money. I mean, my attitude is always, all of the money is bloody. The question is only, what are the terms? And that's what people have to look at. Are you agreeing to terms that in effect strangle you, that restrict your ability to say what needs to be said and operate, or what? And I think that's what people have to look at and understand. And here's the other thing. I, as someone who's been very supportive of Colin Kaepernick, I think that one of the mistakes that he made is that he did not promote the building of a movement. And he basically made a personal statement, a very courageous one, but a personal statement, but didn't appreciate that this was movement building time, and that this personal statement, particularly given who he was, necessitated the construction of a mass movement, and that there were thousands of people that were ready to embrace that and join with him. He handled this as an individual act. All right, Nike comes to him and they basically say, we're going to support this individual act. We're not supporting a movement. We're supporting your courage. Well, who can object to that?
Right.
Who can object to his, them supporting his courage? But it's missing the point that what we needed and still do is a movement that takes Colin's courage and goes farther.
So I'm wondering how much of that misstep that Colin Kaepernick made do you think is attributed to his youth? Because, you and I have been in the movement for a while. So we understand the need to build movements outside of individual acts. And sometimes it's not something that's always second nature. Even if you've been in the movement for a long time, you do have to kind of sometimes step back and say, if I'm going to respond to this, am I going to respond to this in a way that people are going to rally around me? Or am I going to respond to this in a way that I can pull others in so we can build a coalition to respond to an issue? How much of that misstep do you think is just a function of his youth and immaturity in regard to movement building?
I think it's part of a larger problem that we're living, we continue to live with the legacy of Reaganism. And that one of the things that the Reagan era did is it discouraged, if not ridiculed, collective action. And instead suggested that entrepreneurialism and individual activity was the path forward. And this view permeated even progressive social movements, so that you had individual actors, literally and figuratively, people that might have been celebrities, performers or whatever, artists, political individuals, who saw action as them making individual statements. This has been a controversy in the movement for Black lives, the broader movement. There have been individuals who have emerged, and I'm not going to name names, that have emerged at different points, that have positioned themselves to be the spokesperson for the movement. They're not connected to organization, and they believe that they can say what they can say because there is a short path, a distance between the sentiment of the masses and their ear. And so this is something that infects our movements. I'm not making a criticism of Colin. I don't know what motivates him. I would say, though, that I think it was a big mistake not to treat this as a movement building moment. And that I tend to think, because I see this a lot, that he was not thinking about building a movement, because he's grown up with a generation of people that, how can you put it? Grown up with a generation of people that have often disparaged movements or not even acknowledged the central historical role of social movements, even when they may point to, at different points, the legacy of a Fannie Lou Hamer or a Cesar Chavez or a Philip Vera Cruz or a Malcolm X or whatever. They may point to that, but they don't connect the work of those individuals with movement building.
So wrapping this up, as much as I hate to do it because this is an amazing and fascinating discussion about the history of where rugged individualism actually comes from, and I talk about that a lot, Bill, are you saying that how we keep corporations and politicians from co-opting grassroots and genuine struggle for social and racial justice, movement building, is that the answer?
Building organization. We've got to build, movements come and movements go. Organizations are the link between existing movements and between historical moments. So if you don't build an organization, what you're saying is that you're going to surrender in the face of the opposition, because the opposition has organization. And they understand organization, and they understand that their possession of organization can lead to us being crushed. Therefore, the only real response is to build organization, to develop strategy, and have a vision. So people that are taking on the matter of the Obama library, or taking on the matter of any kind of transformation that's going on in a city, can't do this on the basis of town hall meetings. They can't do this on the basis of sounding off and calling into radio stations or posting something on Facebook. They're going to have to do it on the basis of organization and of organizing the communities that are affected, engaging them politically, engaging them in a way that they're thinking about their own vision for the redevelopment of their neighborhoods. Otherwise, these areas will continue to vanish, as you said in the case of Washington, D.C., which you and I see all the time. Areas that are transforming, and you can't believe that there once upon a time were Black folks in many of these neighborhoods.
You know, many of the revolutionary leaders that we speak of and point to for how we move in these present times to fight for social and racial justice have taught us that the way to make change, the way to force change, to bring about change in any society is to educate, organize, and then mobilize. That's been true of many revolutionary leaders around the world. It is just as true today. So thank you so much, Bill Fletcher Jr., for talking to me about this issue that is bigger than Obama and the Obama Center, bigger than Nike, and bigger than all of us. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
And thank you for watching. This is Jacqueline Luqman with the Real News Network. Educate, organize, mobilize.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.